It should be understood to be a real war. And it's not a new war, it's an old war. Furthermore, it's a perfectly conscious war everywhere, but specifically in the United States, where it's a very free country, but it happens to have a highly class-conscious business class, and always has. And it's very free and open, so you have a lot of information about it. They talk, you have their records, and they have long seen themselves as fighting a bitter class war, except they don't want anybody else to know about it. Occasionally, someone else gets the news. Rather famous case, which I'm sure you know, was Doug Fraser about 20 years ago, 1978, I think, when he pulled out of the Labor Management Council and condemned business leaders for, words were roughly like this, for having decided to fight a one-sided class war against working people, the poor, the unemployed, minorities, even members of the middle class, and for having torn up the fragile social compact that had been achieved during periods of growth and prosperity. In fact, had been achieved, although he didn't say this, primarily through rather militant struggle, very militant struggle under harsh conditions back in the 1930s. Now, the only thing wrong with his statement is that it was way too late. In fact, that war that he's talking about was initiated as soon as the fragile social compact was established back in the 1930s, and very openly. There's no, you don't have to go to secret records to find out about it, nor do you have to have been at the wrong end of the clubs when the strikes were broken up in the late 30s to know about it. It was completely public. The reason it's not well known is because neither the educational system nor scholarship like Harvard and so on pay any attention to it. It's not a topic that's studied. So there's no doubt that one of the major issues of 20th century history, surely in the United States, is corporate propaganda. That's a huge industry. In fact, it extends over obviously the commercial media, but the whole range of systems that reach the public, the entertainment industry, television, a good bit of what appears in the schools, a lot of what appears straight out in the newspapers and so on. Huge amount of that comes straight out of the public relations industry, which was established in this country early in the century and then sort of developed mainly in the 20s and on, and has become an enormous industry. It's now spreading over the rest of the world, but it's primarily here. And its goal from the beginning, perfectly openly and consciously, was to control the public mind, as they put it. And the reason was that the public mind was seen as the greatest threat to corporations. That's from early in the century. Business power was strong, but it's a very free country by comparative standards, and it's hard to call on state violence, not impossible, but hard to call upon state violence to crush people's efforts to achieve freedom and rights and justice. So therefore it was recognized early on that it's going to be necessary to control people's minds. I should say that's not a new insight either. You know, you can read it in David Hume and the Enlightenment, where it was already recognized. In fact, you go back to the earliest stirrings of democratic revolutions in England in the 17th century, and there already was concern that we're not going to be able to control people by force, and we therefore have to control them by other means, controlling what they think, what they feel, their attitudes toward one another. I mean, all sorts of mechanisms of control are going to have to be devised, which will replace the efficient use of force and violence that was available to a much greater extent earlier on, and as has been fortunately declining, you know, not uniformly, but often declining through the years, particularly here, leading to the need for other methods of control. You don't have to move very far from the Cambridge elite to learn about it. the leading figure of the public relations industry is a highly regarded Cambridge liberal, Roosevelt Kennedy liberal, died recently, Edward Bernays, who wrote the standard manual of the public relations industry back in the 1920s, which is very much worth reading. Remember, I'm not talking about the right wing here. This is way at the left liberal end of American politics. His book, it's called On Propaganda, or maybe just Propaganda. I should mention that terminology changed during the Second World War. Prior to the Second World War, the term propaganda was used quite openly and freely for controlling the public mind. It got bad connotations during the Second World War because of Hitler and that sort of thing. So the term was dropped, and now there's other terms used. But if you read the literature in the social sciences and the public relations industry and so on, back in the, say, 20s and the 30s, they describe what they're doing as propaganda. This manual is for the rising public relations industry, and he opens by pointing out that the conscious manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is the essential feature of a democratic society. It's the essence of democracy, as he later pointed out. And he said, we have the means to carry this out now. He said, we have the means to regiment people's minds as efficiently as armies regiment their bodies. And we must do this. First of all, it's the essential feature of democracy, but also, sort of footnote, it's the way to maintain power structures and authority structures and wealth and so on, roughly the way it is. It's worth remembering something else that they usually don't teach you very much about in school, and that is, if you go back to the origins of American society, it was founded on the principle that was stated very explicitly by the leading framer, James Madison, at the Constitutional Conventions, that as he put it, the primary responsibility of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And Madison recognized, he's a smart guy, that this was going to be a serious problem if a democratic system were established. It was going to, if people had the right to vote, he used England as his model. England was the model for democracy in those days, right? It's like, we're talking about 1780s. And he pointed out in the debates on the Constitutional Convention something which everybody ought to read in third grade in a free society. I mean, this is the origins of our society. He pointed out that in England, if they had the right to vote, which fortunately they didn't, he said pretty soon you would find people calling for redistribution of property and for a tax on property rights, for what nowadays we'd call agrarian reform. It was mostly an agricultural society. He didn't use the term agrarian reform, but same thing. He said people will start calling for agrarian reform. Obviously, that's intolerable, and we have to protect our own society against that kind of injustice by ensuring that the rights of property prevail. He recognized that, he said it's a problem now. He was already concerned in the 1780s by what he called symptoms of a leveling spirit. That is, people are trying to, feel that property ought to be more equitably distributed. That's a danger. But he said that the danger is going to become much more severe over time as more and more people are marginalized and dispossessed and secretly yearn for a more equal distribution of life's blessings. Now, if those people get the vote, we're going to be in trouble, because it's going to be hard to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, which is what government's all about. And he therefore designed a constitutional system which was intended to prevent that danger. The system, the way he set it up, he and the other framers, because it was virtually unanimous, and there was virtually no disagreement about this. The one person who might have disagreed, Jefferson, was not part of any of this stuff. The constitutional system, as he designed it, was supposed to put power in the hands of the wealthy, who are the more capable set of men, I'm quoting, Power must reside in the hands of the wealthy, the more capable set of men, with the general population fragmented, factionalized, dispersed, in conflict, and so on and so forth. Well, this is like, we're now 1780s. Okay, it's been a pretty stable system. And as it's been harder, the franchise has increased. So over time, more and more people did get the right to vote. And that just raised the danger. Furthermore, the power of the state to coerce by violence, and that includes the power of private power, like the power of, say, Carnegie to hire Pinkertons and so on. As that has declined, the need to resort to these other measures of factionalization, instilling hatred, marginalizing people, straight propaganda, and so on, that's increased, and very consciously. So by the time you get to the 1920s, where I started from, it's recognized that huge resources must go into the conscious manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses, and we have to regiment them, their minds, as well as an army regiments their bodies, and we have the methods for it, and those methods are advertising, entertainment, straight propaganda in the media, schools, so on and so forth. The 20s was an important period in this regard. It looks as if labor is under attack now, but remember, in the 20s it had been smashed. The major American labor historian, David Montgomery, has a book which you probably know, or should if you don't, called The Fall of the House of Labor. Very, sort of standards, important book on the history of the labor movement. It ends in the 1920s, because that's when the House of Labor had fallen. After, with a lot of violence in that case, state violence, Wilson's Red Scare, the leading labor leader was in jail, Eugene Debs, where the New York Times had said years ago he ought to be sent, and so on. There'd been a big strike wave at the end of the First World War, smashed, labor movement destroyed, the whole thing wiped out. As Montgomery points out at the end of his book, labor had been virtually destroyed. Working people had to privatize their lives and aspirations. They sort of work out survival strategies for themselves, not with others, because the modes of cooperation and common struggle had been eliminated. And they did it, he ends up by saying, in a most undemocratic America, which is true. It was a highly undemocratic country, using a combination of modes of violence and coercion and repression and increasingly propaganda to prevent the dangers that Madison was worrying about, almost 200 years earlier, that more and more people would secretly sigh for a better access to life's blessings and might even do something about it if they had a functioning democracy, which therefore couldn't be permitted. I should just comment, in fairness to James Madison, that these remarks are not quite correct. The reason was that Madison was pre-capitalist. He's like just about everybody, Adam Smith, all the great figures from the Enlightenment. They're mostly pre-capitalist and very anti-capitalist in conception. You can't say they're anti-capitalist because there was no modern industrial capitalism around for them to have an opinion about. And this is a matter of interpretation. It's a matter of how you read texts, so you can read them a lot of different ways. But the way I read them, they were very anti-capitalist. That includes Adam Smith. And I think you can demonstrate that. But certainly Madison was. He believed that when he put power in the hands of the wealthy class of men, the more capable set of men, the wealthy of the country, that they were going to be, as he put it, enlightened statesmen and benevolent philosophers who would devote themselves to the welfare of all. Okay, that's a very pre-capitalist conception, that once you give power to the hands of the rich, they're just going to be benevolent philosophers and they're going to devote themselves, every minute of their day to the welfare of everyone else. I mean, it's like what corporate executives tell you, they're sort of understand you have to say that, but by now, I suppose nobody believes it except the people who read these, watch these movies, which show you how it works. In those days, Madison really believed it, and he very quickly discovered that it wasn't true. Within a few years, by I think 1792, he was already very upset about the fate of this democratic experiment, which he thought was failing. He condemned what he called the daring depravity of the times, as the business leaders who have now been given power use that power, he said, to become the tools and tyrants of government. They overwhelm government with their powers and combinations, and they're bribed by its largesses. And they're just serving self-interest, not the interest of the general public. And he thought that was deplorable and so on, but that's because he perceived the way the system that he had designed was actually functioning. That description, rhetoric is kind of nice. Some people don't use fancy rhetoric like that today, but it's a perfect description of today. What's called the industrial capitalist system today is in fact one in which private power is the tool and tyrant of government, overwhelms it by its combinations, it's bribed by its largesses. That's a pretty good description of 1997. With all the changes that have taken place since 1792, there's a good deal of stability to all this, including the commitment to the principle that the primary goal of government is to protect the minority, the opulent, from the majority. Read yesterday's budget proposal carefully and you'll get a good example of how that commitment plays itself out. And the increasingly significant idea, overwhelmingly significant idea, particularly among liberals, like, say, Bernays, that it is necessary to control people's minds because they're too much of a danger. We, as one of the leading, take a look at, say, the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences big encyclopedia in 1933, so this is still pre-Second World War. There's an entry. There actually is an entry on propaganda. Remember, propaganda was a usable term then. And the entry on propaganda is written by a very distinguished political scientist, liberal political scientist, Harold Lasswell, one of the founders of modern political science, in fact, of communications and so on. And it's worth reading. It's a page or two. Xerox it out and read it. He says, these are paraphrases, but they're pretty close to quotes. He says that we must not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. We're the best judges of their interests. We smart guys. And we must therefore ensure that those idiots out there don't get into trouble, by actually using their theoretical right to vote to interfere where they don't belong, like in the public arena. So we got to keep them out of the public arena somehow and make sure that it's just us smart guys who are in there. And it's for their good, of course. It's kind of like you don't let, your 3-year-old, in my case, grandchild, run across the street, because she may want to run across the street, but it's be improper to let her have that choice. And the same is true about the masses. They have to be controlled. They have to be controlled at the workplace. They have to be kept out of the political arena. They're not going to understand the need to protect the minority, the opulent against the majority. They're going to have all these strange leveling impulses, and they're going to do all kinds of things which will, mess the world up in all sorts of horrible ways. So for their benefit, we have to regiment their minds the way an army regiments their bodies, ensure that they're under control, make it very clear that they don't participate in workplace management, and certainly not in the political arena. They're to be outside somewhere. And the dedication with which this task has been pursued is pretty awesome. Just to take right after the fall of the House of Labor in the 1920s, when American labor really was smashed, and people were privatized and tried to accommodate individually to a most undemocratic America, as Montgomery and others have pointed out. That was a time when there was great awe about the end of history and the utopia of the masters, and it's all over, us good guys have won, everybody else is at our feet, kind of like some of the stuff you read today. And it sort of looked like that. It's pretty much looked that way. Well, a few years later, as you know, the whole thing collapsed, and there was militant working class struggle and all sorts of other popular activism, and there had to be an accommodation. There had to be some kind of accommodation to the to these unwashed masses who were getting out of line, sit-down strikes and all sorts of things. And there was this fragile social compact that Doug Fraser referred to was indeed established. It wasn't a gift, it was won by struggle. Meaning the labor laws and the limited social system. In fact, American workers back in the 1930s began to get the rights that had been standard long before, even in much more brutal societies. You read the right-wing British press over the, say, early part of this century. They can't believe how bad American workers are treated. The same was true of visitors from Australia and so on. By the 1930s, the U.S. was sort of brought into the more or less the mainstream of industrial society on these matters, to a limited extent, in fact, but to some extent. That caused hysteria among the masters. You read the business press by 1936 or 37. Again, these are things which in a really free society everybody would study in elementary school, because they're really important. These give the real framework of the society, in my view. They were talking about the hazard facing industrialists and the rising political power of the masses, and how we must do something to save ourselves or our way of life will be gone and we don't have a lot of time to do it. They started right away. By the late 30s, there was a big anti-labor campaign that had built up. With new techniques. There was still use of force, but it was understood that that's not going to work the way it did. So there was a shift to more propaganda, community the main idea. It's called the Mohawk Valley formula, I guess. Is that what it was called? Something like that. Yeah, Mohawk Valley formula was designed by a lot of public relations hotshots around 36, 37, at the time of some of the steel strikes, to have a new, what they called scientific methods of strike breaking. We don't just come in, with clubs and shoot people and smash their heads and that sort of thing. We do it the scientific way, because the old way doesn't work anymore. And the scientific methods of strike breaking were, in fact, drawn from the public relations ideas of the kind that I talked about. The main idea was to mobilize the community against the strikers and the union activists, to present a picture which is by now so standard that you can hardly turn on the tube without seeing it, because it's just poured out in, like streams ever since then. The basic idea is to present a picture of the world that looks kind of like this. There's us, kind of like a big happy family in the community. The honest workman going off every morning with his lunchbox, his loyal wife who's making the meals and taking care of the kids, the hard-working executive who's toiling day and night in the interests of his workers in the community, the friendly banker who's running around looking for people to lend money to, and so on and so forth. That's us, and we're all in harmony. Harmony was a big word. We're in harmony. We're all together. It's Americanism. You might take a look at that word, Americanism. It's an unusual term. It's the kind of term that you only find in totalitarian societies, as far as I know. So like in the Soviet Union, anti-Sovietism was considered the gravest of all crimes, and the Brazilian generals had some concept like that, anti-Brazilian. But try, say, publishing a book on anti-Italianism and see what happens in the streets of Rome or Milan. People won't even bother laughing. It's a ludicrous idea. The idea of Italianism or Norwayism or something like that, these would just be objects of ridicule in societies that have some kind of residue of a democratic culture inside people's heads. I don't mean in the formal system. But in totalitarian societies it is used, and as far as I know, the United States is the only free society that has such a concept. Maybe there's another one. You might try it in places, But anyhow, Americanism is an anti-Americanism and un-Americanism and so on. These are concepts which go along with harmony and getting rid of those outsiders and all that kind of stuff. Another part is simply to induce hatred and fear among people. So it's a diverse society. You go to Europe, most places are pretty uniform. This is a very diverse society. So it's easy for propagandists, it's pretty easy to get people to hate the guy next door because it looks a little different or one thing or another. And huge campaigns go on to instigate divisions among people. I don't have to tell you about this. It's all so familiar. You go on. But these are very natural techniques of social control. And if you can't control people by force, you have to control their minds, you have to control their attitudes, you have to, exactly like they say. Well, going back to the Mohawk Valley formula, the idea was to move into a community, flood it with, where there's a strike going on, flood it with propaganda, take over the media, the churches, the schools, everywhere else, pour in this propaganda about harmony and so on, the way I described it. And then there's those bad guys out there who are trying to disrupt our harmonious lives, like that union organizer is probably a communist or an anarchist anyway, and probably un-American, and he's trying to, destroy all these wonderful things we have, and we got to band together and kick him out. We have to defend our way of life against this. A lot of religion gets thrown in. Remember that the United States is an extremely fundamentalist country. I mean, you look comparative statistics. Usually religious fundamentalism declines as industrialization goes up. It's pretty close correlation. The United States is off the chart. It ranks with devastated peasant societies, probably more fundamentalist than Iran. There's all, why this is so is, I don't know. But, in fact, it's a complicated question. But one factor is that it was certainly consciously fomented by business leaders. That goes way back to the 19th century, when they were supporting their favorite, John D. Rockefeller's favorite evangelist was, who had poured a lot of money into, was some guy who said that people ought to have more enlightened ideas than labor agitation. That was one of his famous phrases. And the more enlightened ideas are, go to church and listen to orders and, do what they tell you and shut up. That's the more enlightened idea. And it's a really interesting case because the Mohawk Valley was the model that was later used for strike breaking and destruction of the labor movement in the post-war period. So it's quite interesting to see what happened right there. Incidentally, I don't know any literature on this. Do you? Yeah, so these are untouchable topics, And you can almost say that anything that's important, it's going to matter for people's lives, it's got to be sort of off the agenda. And it sort of makes sense. You don't want people to know about it. Like, you don't want people to know the wrong kind of thing. After all, that makes sense. It's like it's not a conspiracy or anything. It's just common sense if you have a certain degree of power and authority and privilege. You just don't want people to know things that might be harmful to them because they're really like children, remember. And we're the ones who have to make the decisions for them. There's an enormous amount of money and effort goes into this. It's not the only thing by any means. There's a lot of other reasons why the United States is so unusual in this respect, but this is one of them. And it's used. Whether that's the source or not, it's certainly used, always. So another technique of trying to create the marginalization of people, the removing people from the actual social and political struggles that might make their lives better. Maybe and to keep them from working with one another by dividing them up in all sorts of ways. And in a myriad techniques, find the fashion to keep the hated masses out of the public arena where they don't belong. And certainly out of anything having to do with control of the economic system where it's unthinkable that they should have a role. That's got to be in the hands of private tyrannies. That's unquestionable. Where the United States has acted internationally, it's the same way. You look at the trail of intervention, it's almost always the same. Not just third world countries, for example. Like I just came back from Italy. Okay, you may not know this, but Italy was the target of the major CIA activities since its origins. The internal record runs dry around the mid-'70s, so don't know, can't say after that. But from the origin of the CIA in 1947 up to at least the mid-'70s, Italy seems to have been targeted more than any other country in an effort to undermine Italian democracy. Italy was regarded as sort of a semi-third world country, had a very strong labor movement. And when the American Army, in fact, the American British armies, what they called liberating Italy in 1943-44, they were appalled to discover that northern Italy had been liberated. by the resistance, which had established a functioning society with very strong labor control. The resistance was mostly labor and peasant-based. They'd held off the Germans, had liberated most of the place. They had instituted worker management in factories. They had thrown out what were called, what the Americans and British, they were protecting workers, what they call, I'm now speaking for the terminology of the U.S. British documents. They were keeping useless workers and throwing out, arbitrarily dismissing owners and bosses. And that's, of course, intolerable. And the system was functioning. And furthermore, they were focusing on unemployment, which was recognized was Italy's major problem. But that's their problem, not our problem. Our problem is to restore the traditional structure, which meant traditional hierarchies. Actually, it meant restoring fascist structures and fascist collaborators and so on. And a big effort was made to do that. And it was not entirely successful. By 1948, when the first election took place, it looked as if labor-based forces would probably win. And a huge effort went into trying to ensure that that wouldn't happen by withholding food. Italy was starving, by restoring the police to fascist control, by all sorts of threats and manipulation. Pretty big operation, and the first major CIA operation, among others. And they took it really seriously. Again, something you would learn in a free society is there's a thing called the National Security Council, which the main planning outfit, which publishes, it doesn't publish, but it produces documents, top-level planning documents, which are among, not the only important ones, but among the most important ones. They tend to get released maybe 35 years later, so you can look back at them. So we have them now from the late 40s. And the first one, NSC 1, 1947, is devoted to Italy. And it calls for, it says, we're going to try all these measures to ensure that Italy doesn't have a free democratic government, which would have, they don't say it this way, but what amounts to that, in which there'd be a big role for the organized working class in Italy. And they say, but if this doesn't work, if the communists, as they call them, which means, in fact, a lot of them were communists, but if the communists come to power through a legal vote, through a legal election, then the United States is going to declare a national emergency and is going to support military activities inside Italy to overthrow the democratically elected government. That's how seriously they took it back in 1947. They also knew exactly why the communists were powerful. You read it in the records extensively. It's because they were honest, because they were supporting working class interests. It's true that they were collaborationists. They weren't trying to separate Italy from the Western Alliance or anything, but they were defending working class interests, and people supported them. And they had a mass-based working class party. There were plenty of others besides communists. But they had to be prevented either by coercion, like, say, withholding food and violence, or if that didn't work, by direct intervention, military intervention. It was taken very seriously, and in fact, it goes up to the present.
How is it that the wealthy can, quote, pull the wool over the eyes of the American worker by controlling the power in government and using it against the working public, using it against labor unions?
Well, take right now, let's say, as an example. There's a couple days ago, I don't know if you're bothered, I put myself through the pain of reading the New York Times every day for some masochistic reason, which I won't try to explain. But they've got their big chief correspondent, sort of the main thinker, is a guy named Thomas Friedman, who had an article 3 or 4 days ago, in which he, big think piece, in which he said, the Cold War's over, so the breakdown isn't hawks and doves anymore. We have to have some new breakdown. And he said the new breakdown, he says there's two. One is between integrationists and, what's the other term? I forget. Anti-integrationists. That means people who are in favor of more globalization and what they call free trade, which isn't free trade, and all that kind of stuff. And people who want to slow it down or end it. That's one break. And the other is between people who are in favor of a safety net and those who think that everybody ought to, be on your own and get what you can. Okay, so those are the two ways people break up. And that gives you 4 possible types of people, right? Two of them he sort of dismisses as lunatics. So there's the Zapatistas and Ross Perot. They fit into two of those boxes. The other two boxes are sort of sane people, Clinton and Gingrich. And I'll put aside Clinton, but Gingrich, and this gets right to your point, I think, Gingrich is put in the corner that says integrationist and devil take the hindmost, everybody for themselves. Well, that's testable. It's testable that that's Gingrich's position. For example, on the question of whether Gingrich is an integrationist, like in favor of free trade, we can ask how he reacted when the Reagan administration instituted the greatest wave of protectionism since the 1930s. That's just straight protectionism, alongside of huge increase in public subsidies to private power, to industry, along with, say, the biggest nationalization in American history, the takeover of Continental Illinois Bank, and so on and so forth. That's all radically anti-integrationist. Okay, how did Gingrich react? We can ask that question. Answer is he thought it's great. What about the safety net story? I mean, Gingrich is in favor of people sort of being out there on their own, rugged entrepreneurs and so on. I mean, you can check that too. He represents a county, district, Cobb County, Georgia, which happens to be and he happens to hold the national championship in bringing federal subsidies to his rich constituents, to be precise, among suburban counties in the United States. Cobb County ranks third in federal subsidies, ranks right after Arlington, Virginia, which is part of the federal government. So, of course, they get a lot of federal subsidies, like the Pentagon's there and so on. And Brevard County, Florida, which is the home of the Space Center. So it's another part of the federal government. But if you move outside the federal government itself, Gingrich's district is number one. They get more federal subsidies than anybody. The biggest employer in Cobb County is Lockheed, which is a publicly subsidized private profit corporation. I mean, they don't, they sell commercial planes, but those are just, as everyone knows, they're just, they use military technology is, the way the system is designed, technology is developed under the guise of the military and then handed over to private power when it works. That's true of everything. Airplanes, computers, the internet, you name it. And Cobb County is right at the center of this. Well, he's in favor of being, all out on your own and fighting in this harsh world. Ridiculous. He's the biggest welfare freak in the country. That's literally true. Except that he wants the welfare to go to very rich people. Notice this is not what's called corporate welfare. What they call corporate welfare, which also never gets touched, is some different category completely. That's like giving a special, shot in the arm to some particular corporation. This is something quite different. This is the way in which our economy works. The way our economy works, take just about any dynamic sector of it at least that I know and I've studied, and you find that it's based on massive public subsidy and privatization of profit. Public pays the costs and takes the risks, and private systems make the profit, if there is any. Cobb County is just an extreme example of this. Now, you ask, how come people are deluded? Well, how often do you read this? These aren't particularly subtle facts. These are like glaringly obvious facts.
That's my question.
Okay, because the reason is because people like Thomas Friedman and everyone else in the business knows you're not supposed to write about these things. I don't know. I'm not claiming he thinks about it. In fact, the people who write about it are probably more deeply propagandized even than the people they're talking to. You cannot be a good propagandist unless it's in your bones. It's extremely hard to lie. I think we all know that from personal experience. It's hard to lie to people. Every one of us lies to people all the time, unless we're some kind of crazy angels. But the way we do it, I'm sure you know this, is you first convince yourself that what you're saying is true. Like you're an 8-year-old kid, and you steal a toy from your brother, and your mother comes in and yells at you. You don't say, well, I wanted the toy and he had it, so, I took it because I'm stronger than him. What you say is, it really wasn't his, and besides, he'd taken a toy of mine, and anyway, I needed it more than he did, so it was right for me to take it. Okay, I mean, if people that haven't had that experience, there are some other species, I think, but that kind of experience goes all the way up to being a hotshot journalist for the New York Times. You don't even make it into those circles unless you're already so deeply overwhelmed by doctrine and propaganda that you can't even think in other terms. And so you'll read, say, liberal columnists in the New York Times very angrily saying, when people talk like this, nobody tells me what to write. I write anything I feel like, which is absolutely true. And if they didn't, if people with real power weren't sure that they were going to say the right things, they wouldn't be in a position to write anything they feel like. Well, how does that work? It starts from childhood. It starts in kindergarten on television. There's selection for obedience from the very first moment. I mean, you just think about, I'm guessing, maybe I'm wrong, so you tell me if I'm wrong, but at least when I think about my own school experience or any other school experience I know about, there was selection for obedience. I mean, I ended up going to fancy colleges like this place. And the way I did it was, I know exactly how I did it, by shutting up. Like if I thought that the high school teacher was a horse's ass, which I did most of the time, I didn't say, hey, what you're saying. Actually, sometimes I did and got thrown out of class. But I learned not to say anything. Just say, okay, I'll do the next stupid assignment. And because I know that that's the way I get ahead, and ultimately I'll do this and that. If you have whatever ability it takes to do this kind of thing, and you are sufficiently disciplined and passive, you sort of make it through up to the higher echelons. There are people who don't. I mean, I know some, like some of my own kids just didn't, and they get into trouble. They're called behavior problems, or disruptive, or you stick drugs in them, or something or other, because they're just too independent. And people who are independent are a pain in the neck. They disrupt the system. And they're going to be cut off one way or another. I can tell you, just in graduate school, I'm teaching mostly graduate school, you read applications, you can detect between the lines when the person who's writing a recommendation is telling you, keep away from this person, they're going to cause you trouble, which means usually they're going to go off and do their own thing or something like that. I don't want to exaggerate. In the sciences, it's somewhat different. And the reason is the sciences simply require this kind of independence. They'll die, unless people are challenging all the time and questioning. So when you look at people who are, say, studying physics at MIT or something, yeah, it's totally different. Because you just encourage people to be challenging and creative and so on and so forth. But in most areas, you don't. You want them to be passive and obedient and supportive and to fit their, to fit some kind of niche inside a managerial system, which is top-down and doesn't make too much of a fuss and so on. And the people who don't accept this, they're weeded out in one or another fashion. So, it's a tricky question. I don't mean to suggest there's an easy answer to your question, or if there is, I don't know it. But it seems to me that an awful lot of our whole system of kind of thought control, by that I mean education, television, family life, all sorts of things, is sort of geared to supporting that kind of passivity. And institutions that break out of it, as the labor movement does, they are subject to a lot of, they're crushed insofar as one can crush them. I mean, the labor movement always broke out of this. Its picture was always different from the very beginning. You go back to the beginnings of the labor movement, it's, farmers bitterly opposing the degrading and oppressive modes of industrial capitalist organization that were being forced on them. Actually, one of the most interesting books I know, if you haven't read it, I'd urge you to, is the first modern book on labor history that I know of, by a guy named Norman Ware, around 1924. It was just reprinted, so it's easy to get, but it's about the labor movement in eastern Massachusetts around 1850 and 60. It's mostly quotes from the labor press, which are just fascinating. It's mostly young women from the farms, what they called factory girls, like 18-year-old kid comes in from the farms and she's working in the mills in Lowell, or artisans in Boston, you know, and people like that. They had their own press. They had a very lively, extensive press, big, in fact. You know, it's like the scale of the commercial press in those days. And it's very interesting. I mean, it's very eloquent, it's very well written. They took for granted, as the labor movement always has, unless it's beaten out of people's heads, that those who work in the mills ought to own them. They regarded industrial capitalism as just another form of slavery. This is without, you know, no Marx, no socialism, you know, no foreign radicals, none of that stuff. It's all just working people from their own experience. You know, very literate, incidentally. Like one of the things they complained about was that their culture was being taken away from them. Like an artisan in Boston, if he had a little extra money, would hire a boy to read to him, and that meant read classics. You know, they regarded they said, look, the values that we fought for in the American Revolution, they're being taken away from us. We're being forced into another kind of tyranny, which we don't want, namely the tyranny of the hierarchic industrial system. And they also opposed what they called the new spirit of the age. This is like 1850. The new spirit of the age is gain wealth, forgetting all but self. Okay, ever hear that one? A little fancier, but the same thing that is drilled into everyone's head every day today. You know, you got to gain wealth, forgetting about everybody else. Well, they were trying to drill it into people's heads in 1850, and they were resisting it because it's degrading. You know, it's not the way human beings are. It takes a long time to drive normal human sentiments out of people's heads, and they keep popping up again. And in fact, I think, at least looks to me, the whole history of the labor movement is a struggle against the new spirit of the age. Well, that's one of the reasons it's constantly repressed. And other independent efforts are also constantly repressed, not always successfully. Like, the world's a lot better than it was 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, for that matter, because these struggles tend to, you know, they get repressed, but they leave a residue. They have successes, and then they're beaten back, and then they go on from those successes, and over time it sort of gets better. Structures that are based on authority and dominance will try to will just normally act without anybody even thinking about it to block such tendencies. Now, sometimes they think about it, like in the manuals of the public relations industry. They think about it very hard, but you know, they're putting out billions of dollars a year to control the public mind. You better think about what you're doing. But most of the time, you don't think about it. You're just part of it. You know? Like, you don't think about the fact that when you go through school, you're being trained for obedience and passivity. But I think if you look back, you'll probably, at least if you're like my experience, will recognize that that happened. And when you watch television, let's say, you know, some sitcom, you don't think, well, I'm being exposed to the Mohawk Valley formula. But you are. I mean, that's the picture of life that's presented day after day after day. On, you know, like people have personal problems or something like that, but nothing that would bring them together to work for some, you know, to struggle against the new spirit of the age. I mean, what's the last time you saw a sitcom about that? And in fact, what you get is this, you know, this stuff that flows out of the PR industry, very consciously. You know, I mean, in that case, it's mostly conscious. Another aspect of it is demonizing labor. So a major element in the huge public relations propaganda after the Second World War, you know, was strictly demonizing labor. And the labor movement knew that. You know, there was a fairly substantial labor press even then. As late as the 1950s, there were still about 800 labor newspapers, which were reaching maybe 20 or 30 million people a week. You know, not commercial media, but pretty substantial. And they're interesting reading, too. They were trying to, as they put it, provide. This is just. I'm not talking about anything radical. You know, it's like no left-wing press or anything. Just labor newspapers. You know, the conservative American labor movement. We're talking about developing antidotes to the poisons of the kept press, commercial media, who were demonizing labor at every opportunity and trying to undermine our achievements and glossing over the crimes of the corporate rulers who run the society. You know, stuff like that. There's a good book on this one, too. This just tells you something about American academic life. The first study that I've ever heard of, you know, in the United States on this major theme of modern history just appeared. University of Illinois Press. It's a book called Selling Free Enterprise by a woman named Elizabeth Fones Wolf, F-O-N-E-S-Wolf. It's kind of apolitical, but like she doesn't have, as far as I can see, any special point of view, but the material in it is pretty revealing. It's the next part of the story that I was going to get to. This hazard-facing industrialists, and the rising political power of the masses that led to the Mohawk Valley Formula and so on, that terrified the daylights out of the business community. Now, it was kind of put on hold during the Second World War, but it took off immediately after the Second World War at a huge scale, instantly, And that's what she's talking about, selling free enterprise. The idea was, as they put it, remember that the United States came out of the Second World War pretty social democratic, like most of the world. Like those Italian workers who had to have ideas about worker management beaten out of their head by force. An awful lot of people in the United States, too, like maybe half, thought that there ought to be popular control over industry in some fashion. This is so exotic in the United States that the fashion was never described, but somehow that the government could do a better job than private power, things like that. There was enormous support for social programs, medical programs and so on. That had to be beaten out of people's heads, and fast. The leaders of the public relations industry, she quotes a lot of them, they said, look, we have 3 to 5 years to save our way of life. We have to fight and quickly win what they called the everlasting battle for the minds of men, and indoctrinate people with the capitalist story so fully that they can repeat it, on every opportunity, and on like that. And they weren't kidding around. I mean, for example, about 1/3 of the material in American schools, elementary schools, was coming straight out of corporate propaganda offices by the early 50s. Sports leagues were taken over. The churches were taken over. The universities were attacked. I mean, it was across the board. Major effort to try to win the everlasting battle for the minds of men. And it's still going on. I mean, here it's conscious. That part of it's conscious. Most of the participants, it's just, it's in your bones. I mean, you've gone through especially if you've been through an elite educational system, and then you're really deeply indoctrinated in it. So I don't know how to measure this, but like personal feeling is that you find more passivity and obedience in the elite centers than you do, like, out in the streets or in the state colleges. Well, Adam Smith once, you're supposed to worship him but not read him, but it's worth reading too. He once remarked somewhere that if you find 2 businessmen talking to each other, they're involved in a conspiracy against the public, something like that. And yeah, there's something to that, but it's not as though, I mean, you can read descriptions like what you're saying, incidentally, in the business press. So, for example, in the Financial Times in London, which is like the main, the most important business newspaper in the world, a couple of years ago they had an article by the economics correspondent of the BBC, it's all very establishment stuff, in which he said that something like this, that what's evolving is what he called a de facto world government in a new imperial age. And the de facto world government is a set of shadowy institutions. I mean, they're there. You sort of know they're there, but you don't know what they're doing, which basically serve the interests of transnational capital and financial institutions. And he said, for example, the G7, the 7 big rich countries, meaning just their executives, and their leadership. Nobody else knows what they're doing. The IMF, the World Bank, then the GATT Council, now it would be the World Trade Organization, and yeah, they get together and they're running a de facto world government. I think that's kind of a, it's kind of a metaphor. I mean, like, it's not that they get together somewhere and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. They do get together, but it's usually extremely boring. Like, if you were unfortunate enough to have gone to this Davos conference the other day, I'm sure you would have been bored out of your mind. I mean, I didn't go and I didn't see the document, but having read things like that, I do a lot of reading of this stuff. Like the Trilateral Commission is one of them, and they publish regular documents. It's so boring. I mean, after a couple of years, I stopped subscribing. It was so predictable and boring and pablum and so on and so forth. And besides, you can read it in Foreign Affairs or the New York Times business page or wherever you want any day. But yes, they do get together, and sometimes when things get scary, they really do things. So say take the Trilateral Commission. the one publication of theirs which really is interesting and worth reading. This is the commission that was put together by David Rockefeller around 1973, and it's one of the ones that people refer to when they talk about this, secret nexus of rulers and so on. Although, as I say, it's mostly a bore. But in 1975, the first publication was very interesting, and I'd urge you to read it if you haven't done it. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. And it's very much in line with the kind of stuff I was talking about before. Remember, this is the first getting together after the 60s. Okay, all this ferment went on in the 60s, which, women and minorities and all kind of people who are supposed to be kept in their place were suddenly trying to get into the public arena and do something about their interests. And that, again, drove people crazy, just as did the working class struggles in the 30s. So here you have a gathering of elites. Trilateral means United States, Europe, and Japan. So these are elite elements, mostly liberal, on the liberal side, incidentally. Like if you look at the composition, it's around, roughly speaking, around Carter Democrats. In fact, the whole Carter administration, including Carter himself, was drawn from this group. That's roughly the complexion, both in all three of the countries. And they were concerned about what they called the crisis of democracy. And it's interesting to read what they said, because at that point they were concerned. The crisis of democracy is the fact that normally passive and marginalized parts of the population, the overwhelming majority, are suddenly trying to get into the public arena to press their demands. Well, like if you believe the stuff they teach you in civics classes, that's supposed to be democracy. But if you're smart enough to have made it to Harvard, you know that that's the crisis of democracy, and we got to stop it. And in fact, the American rapporteur, the guy who wrote the U.S. part of it, is a professor at Harvard. Shortly after he got one of my favorite titles, he was called Professor of the Science of Government at Harvard. I've always liked that one. Sam Huntington, yeah. I think he's now a university professor or something. But he wrote the American side of this trilateral thing. But the others are more or less the same. I don't mean to suggest he's different. I think he's a kind of like a New Deal Democrat or something, probably, isn't he? Something like that. He's like we're not talking about Jesse Helms, okay? This is in fact, he gave his ideal, described the good old days, sort of let his hair down a little. He said in the good old days, he said before the crisis of democracy, he said Truman had been, this is almost a quote, Truman had been able to run the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers. Okay, that's that alleged conspiracy you're talking about. Of course, he's exaggerating. It wasn't just Truman and a bunch of Wall Street lawyers and financiers. But that's the image. That would be perfect. If we had that, there'd be no crisis of democracy. But when you have women and blacks and young people and old people and farmers and all these scum trying to get into the public arena, yeah, that's a problem. Exactly the problem that Madison worried about, in fact. So you got to somehow marginalize them. All right, in this case, they were public. I mean, it is public in a way. I mean, that is, you can read it. You got to work a little to find it, and it's worth reading. But most of the stuff it's very boring. It's like the literature of social science. It's hard work. I mean, you got to do it if you feel a duty.
Most of the countries in the world have normal bilateral relations with Cuba. Why is the U.S. virtually alone in its hostility toward Cuba? What explains U.S. policy?
Let me just report again some truisms that you would read all over the front pages of the newspapers if there was any commitment to trying to tell important and uncontroversial truths. There's nothing I'm going to say that's in the least controversial. But let's run through the history, because it's interesting. Cuba was the first foreign policy problem for the United States. It goes back to the 1820s. This is no new thing. Back in the 1820s, the nice guys like Thomas Jefferson and so on, who were planning to take over the hemisphere, saw Cuba as the next place to pick up. Okay, they'd already stolen Florida from its inhabitants, claiming to have taken it from the Spanish, but actually from its inhabitants. And their eyes were now kind of moving toward the west, but also on Cuba. That was the next prize. Well, there was a little problem. The British fleet. There was a British deterrent just as in the 1960s there was a Soviet deterrent. And in fact, the British were the hated enemy in those days, mainly because of their power. They were preventing the United States from expanding, like they prevented the United States from conquering Canada a couple of times, which the U.S. has been trying to do since 1775 and may have finally achieved in the so-called free trade agreement. But yeah, Cuba was sitting right there, you know, it's a valuable place. He couldn't get there because the British are in the way. John Quincy Adams, I guess it was, suggested that we just be patient. He said it'll drop into our hands like a ripe fruit by the laws of political gravitation. Okay, meaning by the time we get stronger and the British get weaker, things will shift around. We'll be able to take it over. Okay, by the end of the century, that had happened. By the end of the century, the British were sort of being pushed out of the game. The United States was getting more powerful. And during something that is sort of ludicrously mistitled the Spanish-American War, the United States intervened in Cuba primarily to prevent it from liberating itself from Spain. You take a close look. That's an interpretation, so you want to make sure, you know, don't take my word for it. But I think if you look, you'll find that what happened is that the intervention in Cuba was primarily an effort to make sure that its liberation from Spain didn't mean liberation. And in fact, Cuba was quickly turned into an American plantation with all kind of restrictions on its options and, you know, bought up by American agribusiness and so on and so forth. When Cuba tried any funny ideas about moving towards independence, it was smashed down. For example, Franklin Roosevelt is famous for the good neighbor policy. We don't intervene anymore in the affairs of our neighbors. Well, take a look at 1934, when Cuba made the mistake of trying to elect a sort of, I guess, moderate social democrat of more or less independent ideas as president. That's going too far. Okay, so out. So it continues up through 1959. Okay, 1959, Castro comes along. There was a little bit of toying with the question of whether we can maintain the new Cuba in our system or not. And this is not a new policy issue. Remember, it's back to the 1820s. Hasn't changed much. Within a couple of months, it was decided that Castro's too big for his britches. There's no Russians, incidentally. He's anti-communist. You know, in fact, he was jailing members of the Communist Party. There was no question of the Russians or the communists or any of this kind of stuff. By late 1959, U.S. planes were already bombing Cuba from Florida bases. The State Department claims they didn't know about it. You know, yeah, sure, okay, but I mean, try that if, say, Cuban planes bombed the United States, you know, and say, well, okay, the Cubans didn't know about it. Okay, so, but it was happening. In March 1960, the Eisenhower administration made a formal decision. It was secret, but now it's declassified, so you can find out about it. They made the formal decision to overthrow the Cuban government and take it over. Okay, that's March 1960. Remember, no Cold War, no Russians, no communists, just independent Cuba. From that point on, March 1960, up until today, Cuba has been subjected to extensive international terrorism, economic strangulation, without an end. And it's not trivial stuff. Just to give you one small example, this one comes from an absolutely impeccable source, Raymond Garthoff, who's a very conservative and respected historian right inside the CIA and the intelligence apparatus, now writes historical work on all this stuff. Take a look at his books on reflections on the missile crisis, which he's writing sort of partially from the inside, partly from as a historian. Well, there's a little item in there somewhere where at the peak of the missile crisis, you know, before it, you know, when it had sort of theoretically been solved, but it still was not over. So, like, the missiles were still there. At the peak of the missile crisis, one of the mongoose teams, these terrorist teams that Kennedy had sent into Cuba to smash the place up, one of them, which was apparently acting out of control at the time, like there's no evidence that Kennedy had ordered it to do this, but so maybe it was on its own. But one of them blew up a petrochemical plant in Cuba, which, according to him, he doesn't verify it, but he says it's alleged, and he apparently takes it seriously, that 400 workers were killed. Well, you know, suppose Cuba blew up a factory in the United States and 400 people were killed. Do you think it might make the newspapers? In fact, they'd probably be we'd nuke them, you know. Okay, but this is us. And this is incidentally one tiny footnote to a long history of terrorism. And this was right at the peak of the missile crisis, when for all I know, Cuba had its fingers on the missiles. I don't know that, but anyway, somebody did. Okay, now try just for those of you who want to know about why people believe what they do, just do a little check and find out how much information you can find out about this. Okay, I mean, I've told you that. I'll save you the trouble. This is it. I've repeated it in probably 20 times in books that nobody would dream of looking at or reviewing and so on. But that's one little item. And then it goes on to poisoning crops and livestock and shooting down fishing boats and strafing hotels and blowing up airplanes and all sorts of things. Meanwhile, the economic strangulation goes on, okay, permanently. Now, the only issue debated in the United States, for a long time, there was a pretense we got to do this because of the Russians. Okay, because Cuba is a tentacle of the Russian monster trying to strangle us. I mean, in an intellectually free country, everybody would laugh. In fact, when Kennedy once tried to get the Mexican ambassador to join in some anti-Cuban action back in the early '60s, the Mexican ambassador actually told him, he'd like to do it, but if he announces it in public in Mexico that Cuba's a threat, he said 40 million Mexicans will die laughing. Okay, that's basically true. I mean, the idea that Cuba could be a threat even if it's armed by the Russians. I mean, it's as if like to try to find. I can't even think of a counterpart. But let's suppose, say that before the end of the Cold War, Russia had been carrying out massive terrorism against Denmark and strangling the country. Let's imagine it could do that because it said that Denmark was a threat. Well, Denmark was way more of a threat to Russia than Cuba is to the United States. I mean, Denmark's an advanced industrial country. It's a member of a hostile military alliance, well armed. And, I mean, if the Russians had said that, you wouldn't laugh. It would be a sign of their lunacy, and maybe we got to murder them or something like that. But we say that all the time, and that's okay because that's us. We're properly indoctrinated. To judge how much of a Russian threat it was, bear in mind that the formal decision to overthrow the government was taken in March 1960 when there's no Russians. Okay, and it continues under the pretext of a Russian threat as long as the Russians were around. And then what happened when the Russians disappeared? Okay, so November 1989, Berlin Wall falls, no more Russians. What happened to Cuba? I mean, if the story of the last 30 years that we hear from Arthur Schlesinger and everyone was true, well, we should have welcomed Cuba with open arms. No more tentacles of the Russians. Is that what happened? No. We drew the noose tighter. Okay. All of a sudden, it wasn't because the Russians were a threat. It was because we love democracy so much, as you can easily demonstrate by looking at what we do around the world. Okay, but and if you take a look at the educated classes, they didn't skip a beat. From one day to the next, it's defending ourselves against the Russian threat to loving democracy. Okay, with this history out in the open. Now, that's a real achievement. I doubt that a totalitarian state could achieve anything like that. Anyhow, up until now, it's, well, we love democracy so much. And then the only question is, well, what's the best way to achieve democracy? Is it the Helms-Burton Act, or is it by the Canadian Prime Minister going there? And this is discussed as if it was serious. That's the interesting part. I mean, this is discussed as if, it's not 40 million Mexicans die laughing, which it ought to be. It's discussed as if it could conceivably be serious. It can't possibly be serious. The only question is how to make sure that Cuba will go back into the box in which it was supposed to be put in 1820. If they can force it back there by one or another means, fine, we'll accept Cuba. We'll even call it a democracy, even if it's run by some brutal murderer, like we call Mexico a democracy, or we call Colombia a democracy. In fact, the best democracy in the hemisphere. Even has an independent political party, which was allowed to function in 1985. Since that time, about 3,000 of its activists have been murdered, mostly by security forces and paramilitary forces, including every presidential candidate and most of the mayors. But, it's there. It's got to be a democracy. And since we love democracy so much, we think it's fine. But so maybe if Cuba ends up with democracy like that, it'll be fine as long as it follows orders. There ought to be 100 million Americans who die laughing over this. And the fact that they're not is an indication of the grip of the doctrinal system, which is really powerful. And in this case, primarily among the more educated sectors. If they don't know these things, it's a conscious decision not to know. It takes work not to know these things. Like, you don't have to, really explore.
Given that it's a battle for the minds of the masses and the fact that it's critical to mobilize those masses to achieve any rights for workers, do you see any solutions short of revolution?
Sure. The solutions that have worked all through history. How did workers' rights get established more or less in the 1930s?
Revolution.
There was no revolution. There was a threat. There was certainly a threat. Like when working people took over General Motors. Yeah, that's no joke. People got scared. Yeah, okay. Because the next thing they'll come to their heads is, what do we need the bosses for? Maybe they'll get as smart as the factory girls in Lowell, 150 years ago, and say, look, we don't need those guys. We'll run it ourselves. And you got to make sure that doesn't happen, because that's really trouble. So yes, there was an accommodation, and in fact, right through history, that's the way it's worked. Nowadays, people who consider themselves more or less progressive, whatever that term is supposed to mean, think that they got a pretty rotten life. Look at our problems. Well, there's plenty of problems, but it's a lot better than it was 30 years ago, let alone 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So nowadays, you're worried about how to protect some kind of medical system. Worrying about that 30 years ago, there wasn't any. Or take, say, women's rights. Okay, plenty of problems about women's rights, like, the way affirmative action is being used to attack people. It wasn't a problem 30 years ago. There was no rights. Or take, issue after issue. It's just things are, over time, the struggles take off from a higher level than before. So like you think it looks bad for labor now, have a look at the 1920s. The fall of the House of Labor in a most undemocratic America, when workers could do nothing more than try to pursue individual survival strategies. And remember, that was the period of mass industrialization, establishment of the automobile industry. It's like not a rural country. Well, what you do is try to keep making things better. Is it a revolution or not? That's kind of like a question of definition. If it's possible, I think myself, I agree with those mill hands in Massachusetts that the people who work in the mills ought to own them, generalized. Well, all right, if there's steps toward that happening, I guess you could call it a revolution, but I don't see why it shouldn't just happen.
I'm referring back to your comments about the media and the great public relations that ploy and
right. But see, I think all that stuff is totally illegitimate. And that goes way back to something much earlier. Why should corporations have any rights at all? Okay. That's not like it's not in the Constitution. Corporate rights are the result. It's not even by legislation. Corporate rights were achieved mostly through courts and lawyers, and pretty recently. The main decisions are early in this century. Like, it's not founded in, it's not graven in stone or anything like that. Actually, there's pretty good literature on this if you're interested. The best book is by a Harvard professor that I know, a guy named Morton Horowitz, who's at the law school, has a couple of books called Transformation of American Law. One of them, I think, goes up till like 1860, and the other from maybe 1860 to 1960. But the main theme of the book, of these two big volumes, it's interesting reading. It sounds kind of dense and so on, but you find it interesting reading. The main theme is how the legal system was reshaped to accommodate to the needs of private power. Okay, all the way through, that's been the main theme of the legal system: how to modify it so that illegitimate tyrannical authority is given more and more power, undermining democratic principles. That's basically, he didn't say it in those words, but that's what it comes down to. And the big step, the major step probably, was the transfer of rights to private tyrannies, which is what corporations are, early in this century. And as he points out, he doesn't go into it much, but I think he's right, this developed out of ideas, kind of Hegelian ideas about the rights of organic entities over individuals, which are also at the roots of Bolshevism and fascism. And I should mention that that comparison may sound exotic now, but it wasn't along 60 years ago. You read, say, mainstream American political economists like Robert Brady, important political economist, was kind of Veblenite, back around the early 1940s, I guess. He wrote books about, big business as a system of power, things like that, in which he points out, these things are basically totalitarian in structure, which they are. So where'd they get their rights? Well, through courts and lawyers, by playing one state against one another. Incidentally, that's something worth thinking about when you listen to this devolution business now. The point of getting power down to the states is so that any business, even a middle-sized business, can make sure that the money goes into their pockets, not in the pockets of poor people. It's trickier to do it at the federal level. So that's why you get all this new philosophy about, federalism and so on. Not that federalism would be bad, but, not when you got private tyrannies around. This establishment of private corporate power is a dramatic example of that. Back, I forget exactly what year, but like early in this century, maybe around 1905 or something, the state of New Jersey figured it could make a killing by getting the big corporations to move from New York, where they always were, over to New Jersey, simply by giving them a lot of gifts. It's kind of like when Alabama gets investment from Germany. Sort of the taxpayers pay for it, but somebody makes a killing. And that's exactly what they did. So New Jersey gave corporations all sorts of gifts, essentially, to move across the river. And that's why you have so many things called, Standard Oil of New Jersey and that sort of thing. Yeah, because they moved across the river so they could be incorporated there. And it's a lot cheaper for the big power because the taxpayers of New Jersey paid them. Delaware was another case. Well, of course, New York had to accommodate, because everybody's moving across the river. That's the new federalism back at the early part of this century. So that's and by such a mechanism, public funds did end up in big, deep private pockets, and corporations gradually got rights that they, that are, in my opinion, totally illegitimate. Those rights can be taken away very simply, without a revolution. In fact, every corporation has a state charter, and they're supposed to be there for some public good, Well, like it was true maybe 200 years ago. Like 200 years ago, we could establish a corporation that would build a bridge across the Charles River or something. Okay, that's what a corporation was supposed to be. It's changed a bit over the years. By now, they are huge tyrannies. I mean, bigger than states, involved in all kind of strategic interactions with one another in violation of any conceivable market principle and so on and so forth. There's no reason why they should exist. I don't think. And the media is just part of it. It's particularly harmful to democracy when media systems are in the hands of private tyrannies. I mean, it's bad enough if the guys who, making shoes or cars, that's bad enough. But when it's control over the doctrinal system and information, that's much worse. That's why I think the stuff that's going on in telecommunications now should really have a lot more attention than it does. I mean, here's this huge system, built at public expense. I mean, you guys paid for it, and as usual, being handed over to private power now that it's profitable. And it's very likely, I think most media analysts with their heads screwed on see, and indeed even report, that it's going to end up in the hands of half a dozen megacorporations internationally. Well, that's worse than the oligopolies that run steel and computers, because here we're talking about a new mode of information and communication and so on, as always built at public expense. And right now, we're right in the middle of it, being handed over to private power, incidentally not being reported. I mean, it's not that there's no reporting, you've heard about the Telecommunications Act, but it wasn't discussed as a public interest issue. It was discussed as a business issue. And in fact, most of the reporting was in the business pages. This is the big legislative achievement of last Congress, Telecommunications Act of 1996. Reported in the business pages, and not as a public interest issue. It's not supposed to be a question of public interest, whether major systems of information and interchange are handed over as gifts to Rupert Murdoch. That's not supposed to be an issue of public interest. The only thing that was discussed was, like, do you give it to 6 corporations or 12, or do you do it this way or that way? Well, that's effective indoctrination when these things don't even occur to people. It takes real indoctrination. But yeah, I think you're right. This is worse than the handing over of decision-making power to private tyrannies, because in this case it's also handing over access to the things that they're going to use for control of the public mind. These systems could also be used to liberate people.
Comment on educational systems, K-12, and the president has just adopted a bunch of good stuff, but there's still a lot of problems there.
Yeah, I'm not sure how good the good stuff is. I'd like to. I mean, the details haven't come out yet, but from the reporting that I've heard, I've read maybe more, the actual proposals that are going to come along are going to be granting benefits of one kind or another to people of income levels kind of like mine, people up to the level of $80,000, $100,000 a year. Well, I forget the last figures, but I think the median income in the United States is something like around 30-some. Now, the idea of giving rich people special benefits so their kids can go to school, well, okay, who's paying? Well, the poor people are paying. So I'm not so sure it's such great stuff when you look at it. Same with other things. The big investment firms, Lehman Brothers in this case, are now circulating brochures. Those of you who are wealthy enough must be receiving these things. They're distributing brochures to their rich customers, telling them, look, we've taken over the health system, we've taken over the criminal system, we're right now taking over the welfare system, we're enriching. Here's a new way to enrich ourselves at public expense. They don't, not their words, this is my translation. The way we will do it is by setting up EMOs, educational management organizations, which will do wonders for the educational system like HMOs do for healthcare, about the same, in fact. Namely, they will be able to take more and more money away from the system and put it in private power, meanwhile shaping care so that it mostly benefits the rich and harms everybody else. And now we can do it for the educational system, the last big government monopoly. It's not put this way. It's all put in terms of efficiency and what nice people we are, and we're going to make everything so much better for everyone, because we're just benefactors and so on. But go through it, and that's what it is. Yeah, I think those are probably the new plans that will be coming along. And I would be very cautious about the Clintons' proposals. Look at them really carefully. See to what extent they're lending themselves to, after all, remember, he has made no secrets about what he is. I mean, he is and always has been a moderate Republican candidate of the business community. He's never pretended to be anything else, Never pretended to be anything else. He's a business candidate. His main influence on the Democratic Party was to move it over to the Republican side with the Democratic Leadership Council. It's not like a secret or anything. He said it, He made it very clear. His record in Arkansas was like that. His influence in the national government was like that. So whatever the Democratic Party may have been, which you can sort of debate, it's now, like, if you can find a difference between Dole and Clinton, I'd like to know what it was. I mean, a policy difference. They're both moderate Republicans. Incidentally, the business press is very well aware of this. I mean, take a look at the Wall Street Journal editorials the first couple of years, or reporting, the first, throughout the whole Clinton years. I mean, at first they were a little nervous because he had some of this populist rhetoric, but pretty soon, within a few months, you start getting, editorials in the Wall Street Journal, and articles, in fact, not just editorials, about how Clinton is the best president business has ever had. They quote the Ford company executive as saying we're getting along with him much better than we did with Bush and Reagan, and on and on. Now, of course, they'd prefer the Gingrich guys, actually with some ambiguity, I should say, because they don't like the small business aspect of the Gingrich people. There's a delicate balance there between holding off the crazies and making sure that the really rich people get everything. So there's been a problem. But as far as Clinton was concerned, they were perfectly happy with him. Yeah, he's a moderate Republican. And I don't think you can say that he's deceived anyone. You know, if you look at his positions all the way along, they've been very clear. If people didn't want to see it, that's their choice. But it's been clear. It's been clear to the business press. It's been clear in his policies. Exactly what kind of education program would be crafted out of that, I'd be very suspicious about it. And I think it's worth a very careful look. I mean, there's plenty of problems with the educational system, but the main problem is that way too few resources go into it. Now, it's not that we don't have money. You know, like there's no budget crisis or anything like that. The country's just flooded with money. Again, read the business press. You know, it cannot find adjectives exuberant enough to describe, you know, the dazzling, stupendous profit growth and, you know, what are we going to do with all those funds and so on. The country's just flooded with money, capital, but all getting very narrowly concentrated. Okay? There's plenty of money around to improve the educational system, and we know exactly where it has to come from. I think that's its main problem. And teachers are way underpaid. You know, they're undereducated. They're not given enough respect. Too many kids in school, in a classroom. You know, not enough educational materials, and so on and so forth. There's no special. You know, nobody has any brilliant ideas about. At least I've never heard any about how people should be educated, except, you know, kids' natural enthusiasm and creativity ought to be allowed to, you know, work in constructive ways. I mean, all this kind of stuff. You know, what's missing is the resources. Fine, so let's provide the resources. So maybe they won't have such dazzling and stupendous profits next year, and instead kids will get a better education. I think that's what ought to happen. But what I'm worried about is that the system is moving towards the kind of privatization which just imposes costs on the public. Remember, all this privatization you hear about, it's supposed to be very efficient. And by some measure, you know, by some ludicrous measure, it probably is efficient. You know, and part of the reason why it's efficient is you don't count the costs. Okay? So like if you suppose they're talking about privatizing the MTA around here, you know, the public transportation thing. All right. Suppose you privatize the system. You and I know how to make it more efficient by the economist's measures. You throw out union workers and you get temps for half the price. And if there's an accident because they never had any training, well, it's just people who are getting killed. You don't measure that. And you cut off the so-called unprofitable bus routes, okay, or subway routes. Like you don't make a lot of money at 11 p.m., okay, so let's throw them out. Well, suppose somebody's stuck somewhere at 11 p.m. and wants to get home. Oh, well, you know, it's entrepreneurial values, you know. Let them hire a limousine or something, you know. And in ways like that, you can make the system more efficient simply by transferring the costs over to the public where you don't measure the costs, okay? So, you know, it looks nice and efficient on some economist's paper, but of course there's huge costs transferred over to the public which you don't measure. We all know this, and that's what privatizing the educational system will be. Also, it's doing something else. It's going after exactly that moral conception that underlies the labor movement from its origins, namely, we're in it together. You know, it's not just gain wealth, forgetting all but self. Like we should care not only that my kid can go to school, but the kid down the street can go to school. That's what's being driven out of people's heads. You know, there's a very powerful effort to drive any of that out of people's heads. You're only supposed to care about yourself, unless you're rich, of course. If you're rich, you're part of big socialist structures called corporations with strategic alliances and plenty of support from the state, and then you're allowed to have all these feelings about, yeah, we work together for us, the rich guys. But everybody else is supposed to be on their own. You know, you're not supposed to care whether the kid down the street goes to school. It's like breaking, it should be very familiar to people in the labor movement. This is the main propaganda against the labor movement all the time. I mean, right to work laws, everything else. You shouldn't work together. That's bad. If you work together, you might do something that matters. Okay, so just be out on your own. You know, and if you can get a voucher, so maybe your kid can go to school, forget about everything else. I mean, look, this is a very much a business-run society, you know. I mean, about the last figures I saw, about $1 out of $6 in the whole economy is spent on marketing. It's an extremely inefficient use of funds, of course. Marketing doesn't produce anything, any public goods. But marketing is a form of manipulation and deceit. It's an effort to create artificial wants, you know, to put people, to control the way people look and think about things. A lot of that marketing is straight propaganda, advertising. Incidentally, most of it is tax-free, or a lot of it is tax-free, which means the way our system works, you pay for the privilege of being propagandized, you know, of having all this stuff dumped on you. Those are not small figures. That's like $1 trillion a year in 1992, something on that order. And yes, these when you've got that much of a commitment to controlling minds and manipulating desires and so on, and doing all the things they talk about in the public relations literature, I'm not making it up, you can read it there, and the social science literature, because this is also standard academic talk too. Well, you know, when you've got those stakes, you're going to work on it hard, and it's going to be hard to fight against. That's what makes organizing tough. It's not just, you know, well, you know way better than me, and I'm not going to talk about it, but you have to break through a lot of psychic resistance. The whole history of the labor movement tells you that. And as I say, this was well understood by mill hands in Lowell 150 years ago. But yeah, it's a big battle. And you're not just struggling against somebody who calls it a right to work act. You're struggling against 5 hours a day of television and the movie industry and the books and the schools and everything else. The scale of the efforts to win the battle for men's minds is enormous. I mean, I thought I knew something about this stuff, but when I read Elizabeth Fohn's Wolf book, I was pretty shocked just to see the scale of the efforts. And the dedication, you know, the frenzied dedication to winning this everlasting battle. It's really pretty impressive, although if you think of the stakes, it's not too surprising.
I was curious about your remarks about the mill hands in Lowell, and that maybe the best idea was for them to own the firms themselves.
Okay, let's just talk about the principle. Okay, I mean, the principle, as far as I can see, goes right back to the Enlightenment. You know, like if you go back to classical Enlightenment thought, I'm now talking about Adam Smith and Jefferson and those guys. The sort of core idea is that people have the right to control their own work. You know, okay, that if a person, here I'll quote a standard formula back in the 18th century, leading heroes of the Enlightenment, is if a person if a person does beautiful work under external command, meaning for wages, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is, because he's not a free human being. Okay, that goes all the way through classical liberal thought, Enlightenment thought. I mean, Alexis de Tocqueville says, under wage labor, the art advances, the artisan declines. Now, you find this going right into the working class movements in Lowell and Lawrence. I think that's just natural. I wouldn't try to convince anybody of it. It seems to me if you think about it, yeah, why should you work on command? I mean, if you work on command, you're some kind of slave. Why not work because it's coming out of your needs and interests? I mean, like, cheap for me to say, I'm in a fancy university in a science department, and I can do that. One of the nice things about being in sciences at fancy university is you really do have workers' control. To a very large extent, we control what we do. Want to work on this topic, I work on that topic. I mean, you got to sell it to funders and this and that, but the degree of workers' control at the elite level is quite substantial. I mean, that's why it's such a privilege to be in a science department. Enormously privileged existence. Forget the money. If they paid you 1/10 the amount of money, it would still be a much better existence than working on command. Now, I think people do know that. I don't think that these Enlightenment ideas are hard to grasp. I think people know that if you work under external control, you may admire what the person does, but despise what he is, because his labor, the sort of central part of your life, is being done at somebody else's orders. and you're not controlling the way it's done or why it's done or how it's used or anything else. Well, you can't have every individual controlling every single thing, but that's why you have democratic structures, because people control things together. You know, okay. I don't know how to. I wouldn't try to convince anybody of this, because I frankly just don't believe that everyone doesn't know it. I think maybe I'm sentimental, but it seems to me if you sort of cut away waves of, layers of distortion and delusion, these things that were considered pretty obvious 200 years ago are still obvious.
What about the idea that the Cold War served certain ideological and political purposes for the U.S., and now the U.S. is seeking a new paradigm?
There's something true about the fact that the Cold War paradigm was extremely useful as a way of controlling people. So, like, say, take the labor movement. One of the ways of controlling, undermining, and destroying the labor movement was weeding out the activist elements on the principle that they're somehow not loyal enough to the state at this time of, when the enemy is at our throats. Well, like any propaganda, even the most vulgar propaganda that comes out of Stalinist Russia, there's always some thread of truth to it. You just couldn't have propaganda that doesn't have some, marginal element of truth. And there was some marginal element of truth here too, but it wasn't very real. It's like the Cuba case. So yes, this has been a very terrific hammer to use over people's heads. And it was understood, I should say. If you haven't read it yet, you should read NSC 68, which was, everybody agrees, was the fundamental Cold War document. It's kind of interesting that its content, everybody recognized it as the major document, but nobody quotes it, with very few exceptions. I'm one. But I have a book called Deterring Democracy, which in the first chapter has a lot of extensive quotes from NSC 68. It's April 1950, and it sort of laid out the basic picture of the Cold War, and it's quite fascinating to read. For one thing, because when you can see why diplomatic historians don't quote it. This was written by the real hotshots, Dean Acheson, Paul Nitze, all these smart guys. It reads like a bunch of raving lunatics, I mean, don't take my word for it. Read it. I mean, I concede I picked out the most dramatic examples, but read the whole thing if you feel like. It's not that long. In my view, it sounds like a bunch of raving lunatics, which is why nobody ever cites it. But they do make some points. I mean, the picture they tell is kind of like a fairy tale. On one hand, there's absolute evil. That's the other side. It's kind of like a fairy tale you'd be embarrassed to read your grandchildren. There's this total, absolute evil, the Kremlin, this and that, which is planning to destroy the whole world and everything that ever existed and so on. On the other side, there's utter perfection. That's us. We're like super angels. The only thing we ever do is work, slave for the benefit of this and that. And it's portrayed in the picture of an exaggerated, a parody of a fairy tale. There's never any evidence given because it's just like a matter of definition. They say it's an essential nature of the Kremlin that it acts this way. So you don't have to even give evidence because it's just part of their nature. And it's an essential property of our nature that we do this sort of thing. Okay, so there's no evidence given. In fact, there is evidence scattered around, very carefully scattered around, so that anybody who's going to look for it is going to have a hard time finding it. And when you do put together the evidence I did in the same book, you find that it completely undermines whatever thesis they have about relative power. But forgetting that, then comes the proposals. The proposals are we're involved in a real war. It's a real war, the Cold War. We have to fight it like a war to prevent this monstrous thing from destroying everything and allowing utter perfection and magnificence to win. And in a war, you've got to have things like just suppression. We have to have suppression of dissent among us. One of our weaknesses is that we're too tolerant and too open and too free. They say that, and that's a weakness. So we have to have just suppression and control of dissent and, make sure that everybody's obedient and so on. And the way to do it is they also call for military Keynesianism. That means transferring public funds to private industry, which was a big issue then, because everybody knew that the economic system is not going to function without a tremendous amount of public funding, state funding poured in. So that was crucial. And that's true of the international economy, too, at that time, very heavily reliant on military spending to revitalize it. And they know all that, and it's laid out. but also that it would be an ideological weapon. It would be a weapon to control people. And that's true, it was. I mean, from then until the game started to go away in 1989, around then, it was a tremendous weapon of thought control. Anything you wanted to block, just yell, or do, yell Cold War. Didn't matter how crazy it was. Sometimes there was some truth to it, sometimes not. So yes, you need a new paradigm, okay? Because how are we going to beat people over the head now that we don't have that around anymore? And if you look through the 80s, it was already obvious through the 1980s that this stuff was going to lose its efficacy. You didn't have to be a big genius to figure out that the Soviet Union was in trouble. So you look at stuff, say, I was writing since the early 80s. I've been saying, look, they're going to have to go to something else. And in fact, right through the 80s, there's an almost desperate search for something else. International terrorism or crazed Arabs or Hispanic narco-traffickers or something or other that we have to defend ourselves against. Or otherwise, how are you going to control everybody? Okay, domestic crime, mostly manufactured. U.S. doesn't have crime levels very different from other industrial countries. It doesn't, in fact. But has a very different perception of crime. Welfare queens, sort of by implication black, driving around in Cadillacs and, that sort of thing. So there's all sorts of effort to, manufacture enemies for people to hate. But a foreign enemy is much better. So here's where the science of government comes in. Now, let's get back to this clash of civilizations thing. Huntington's... everybody is flailing around for some paradigm, some big thing that you can use to control people. And Huntington's idea was clash of civilizations. So, there's Islam and us and all these other things. And the reason why the idea is the reason why the world is so disorderly is because you've got now with the Cold War going, you've got all these ethnic groups killing each other and so on. Well, as usual, it's always a good idea to start by asking about the facts. Whenever you hear anything said very confidently, the first thing that should come to mind is, wait a minute, is that true? So is it true? I mean, is it true that there's more ethnic conflict now than there was 20 years ago? Well, take a look. In most of the big conflicts that are going on around the world were going on right through the Cold War, like Burundi and Rwanda. There were huge massacres going on in the early 70s. Actually, I wrote about them at the time. Nobody was talking about them because it wasn't interesting. But they were there. There are some, in fact, just about every one you pick goes way back. Now, there are some that are new. Those within the former Soviet system, including Yugoslavia. Within the old so-called communist system, yeah, they're new. So like the war in Chechnya or, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Tajikistan, these things are all new. But that's standard. Anytime a tyrannical system breaks down, you have all sorts of conflict internal to it. Just take a look at the breakdown of the European empires. Every single one was like that, and most of them were worse. So first of all, the factual basis is very thin. Now, what about the principle, clash of civilizations? Like, say, the big bad guy is Islam. Well, there are a few problems with that. The most fundamentalist Islamic state in the world is our big ally, Saudi Arabia. How's that fit? I mean, Saudi Arabia is a real... it's not fundamentalist enough for some of the people in it, but it's pretty extreme. Are we trying to undermine Saudi Arabia? Of course not. They're sitting on all the oil, In fact, they're our clients. That's a family dictatorship that we keep in power because they make sure that the money from oil doesn't go to the people of the region, but goes to London and New York. So they're okay. There's no clash of civilizations there. That's state fundamental. What about individual, like non-state? Well, by far the worst ones are the guys who are tearing Afghanistan to pieces. You find more crazy Islamic fundamentalists around than them. I don't know about them. Where'd they get their power from? Well, your pocket, They got $6 billion or so, it's claimed, from the United States and Saudi Arabia through the 1980s. Now they're tearing Afghanistan apart, but it's not nothing that we did. We're only wonderful people. So where is this clash of civilizations between Islam and the West? I don't see it. I mean, Indonesia is an Islamic state. Do you see us trying to undermine Indonesia? I mean, in a lot of rotten things in Indonesia. Like, for example, wages are about half the level of China, which is not so munificent. Do you see us doing anything about that? I mean, I think this is all farce. You know, I mean, I don't mean to say total farce. Like, there must be a new paradigm, you know, something that people can build their careers on and write books about and so on and so forth, which can then be turned into a device of controlling people. That part is true. And maybe this will work, or if it doesn't, you try something else.